Alright, today we will be looking at on-screen movement, the different directions of movement, and what those represent. I'd like to really quickly thank this book, Understanding Movies, by Mr. Giannetti. Great textbook, and a lot of the information will be coming from there. We shall start with movement up and down the screen. So this might be somebody jumping or standing. This is anything in which movement goes towards the top of the screen. A lot of the times this will give a feeling of freedom and soaring. It's got suggestions of joy, power, authority. Overall, this tends to be a positive movement. Now, just like this, moving down the screen is opposite of moving up the screen. So this would suggest things like grief, death, insignificance, depression, or weakness. A lot of the times, especially with death, you'll notice that things can happen like eyes closing, hands dropping to the side, and even natural disasters and events like rain falling or an avalanche. All can be part of upward and downward movement on screen. Okay, movement here, we have movement from left to right, and movement from right, obviously, to left. So let's look at some of what these represent on screen. Movement from left to right, because it follows the direction in which we read, is a natural movement. It feels natural to the audience, and often it is a direction in which our protagonist will travel. It overall is a positive movement, whether somebody is walking in this direction, running, looking, any movement that goes from left to right. Now, as you can guess, moving in the opposite direction, from right to left, is typically negative. So this is an uncomfortable movement. Often it creates tension, and a lot of the times you find that a villain or antagonist will travel in that direction or make movements that way. So just remember, left to right is positive and natural. It's the direction in which we read. Moving from right to left, however, creates a tense and unnatural feeling. Okay, when dealing with movement towards and away from the camera, we get a few interesting occurrences. When you move towards or away from the camera, it is like moving towards or away from an audience. It alters the space, the personal space that the audience perceives. So when a character moves towards the camera, it is seen as strong, assertive, and confident. When a character moves away from the camera, or when the camera pulls away from the character, it is often seen as weak, fearful, and suspicious. Now, this brings in two interesting sub-points, and that is the type of character you're dealing with. Whether you are dealing with a villain, or an antagonist, or a hero, or our protagonist. When a villain moves towards the screen and closes the distance, it is often aggressive, hostile, or threatening. Whereas when a hero or a protagonist moves towards the screen, whether they're a hero or they're just generally attractive, this is seen as friendly, inviting, or even seductive. The whole idea is that you're closing personal space. And when you close personal space, if you like that person, it's a good thing. If you don't like the person and they're a villain, closing the personal space is bad. Conversely, the same thing is true when someone moves away. If a villain moves away, the audience feels safer. When other characters move away, we have a decreased intensity. We also feel that the characters are becoming more remote or withdrawn. So the increase of personal space, the decrease of personal space. One other thing to remember and consider is that most films end with some sort of withdrawal. In some way, the camera and the characters separate, whether the camera pulls back, like in a crane shot, or whether the character rides off, perhaps into the distance, into the sunset. Now we're going to look at the difference between lateral versus depth in terms of movement. So lateral is moving side to side. If you're moving in the depth of the screen, you're moving from the foreground into the background, or vice versa, whereas here you're moving from the left to the right, or from the right to the left, vice versa. So lateral movement comes across as determined. It comes across as efficient. And it comes across, people that move laterally are seen as people of action. Conversely, if you're moving from the foreground to the background or from the background to the foreground, there is an element of slowness, and the movements become dragged out or drug out. Now, why is this important to know? Because the camera serves as a storytelling tool. And with the camera as a storytelling tool, you have to decide whether or not the action is meant to look determined or whether it is meant to appear dragged out. For instance, if the story calls for somebody to walk across the desert, they're filmed moving laterally, their progression across the desert would appear much more efficient and determined, a person of action. However, if the character is seen walking through the desert and they're meandering from the foreground to the background, then that is seen as a very slow and possibly detrimental or difficult journey. Okay, let's now look at how distance and angle affect what you see on screen. Now remember, when we're talking about distance, we're talking about the distance between the camera and subject. And angle, remember, is relative. It is the camera's relative position in relation to the subject. So, the further away, so the greater the distance and the higher the angle. So we'll put, if you have a greater the distance, higher the angle. Is going to cause shots to appear slower and will make events and people seem smaller. These types of shots, for instance, the extreme long shot from a high angle view, so our extreme long shot, high angle, are used a lot in epics. Think Lord of the Rings and fight scenes. Okay? However, the closer the camera is, and the lower the angle, causes events and motion to seem intense and sped up. So dramas use a lot of these close and low angles. And so when we're looking at the difference between the distance and angle in relation to the subject being photographed, a close shot, for instance, of someone crying, will have more movement in it than a shot from a great distance of a parachuter floating down 50 feet. So when we think of these close low angle shots, you might be looking at close-ups from low angles, or even, for instance, the extreme close-up from eye level.